And I will invite Lisa and Elizabeth to do the honors while I do the tech thing here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hofvenschiöld. I'll just do a short introduction while Bibi gets up our presentation. I am an applied ethics practitioner and a futurist working for a large car company. I'm not going to say which one. And we're super excited to share this session with you today and also get your feedback, because we started this conversation a couple of weeks ago in a special session for the APF. And we were so encouraged by the feedback that we got that we would love to see what you have to say about philosophy, ethics, and biofutures, and foresight in general, and what those things mean for us as a community. So maybe I'll hand over to Lisa for a little introduction.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so we're so excited because this is a continuation of the conversation that we started earlier in the year. I echo Bibi and Elizabeth in saying that this can be whatever we want it to be. We've got momentum, and one of the key things we'd ask you to listen for today is our invitation to you, which both Bibi and I and Elizabeth will underscore, but we have an invitation to you directly to be involved in ways that you find meaningful. So, okay, Bibi, I have a quick question for you. Are you all ready?
Yes, we are all set. Can you guys see?
Okay. Yes, we can.
Can you guys see our screen?
Okay. Nicole, I also just want to double check with you. It sounds like if we have someone who wants to be admitted into the room, that you'll take care of that, given the situations we had this morning.
We've got it all covered.
Thank
Don't
you
worry.
so much. Yeah, no, it's all good. Thank you. Okay, so Bibi, why don't you go ahead and we'll go to the next slide. My name is Lisa Whitsett. I sit in Dallas, Texas in the US. I'm a philosophy student at the moment through the University of Wales, which has been a fabulous experience, in part because I've been exposed to philosophies of all kinds. And so for today, from sort of our me to we approach, Elizabeth, Bibiana, and I will do a couple things. We really want to provide a space for all of us to think about our thinking, which is one of the things that philosophy allows us to do. Even if you don't study philosophy as a discipline, we all do sort of philosophical type things in our day-to-day. And we want to touch on that a little bit today. We want to build some fluency together too. We really envision philosophy being part of the discussion of foresight, futuring, and we want to together build some fluency in that language. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be inviting your participation in a very concrete, practical way through some thought leadership pieces that we'd like to write based on what we come up with today. So how we're going to do that today, I'll walk you through some of the philosophical foundations just to give us a framework to think about what is philosophy as a discipline. Elizabeth will walk us through ethical perspectives from multiple viewpoints. There are lots of ways to look at ethics. And then Bibiana will focus on some really exciting real-world data that she has from some of her biofutures research. And as part of that, that's when we'll open it up and ask for some of your feedback, very hands-on feedback and questions. A couple of the outputs that we want today, in addition to a language, is we want to gather your insights. So again, I think Bibiana is planning to put a Miro board up, and we'll have a link in the chat. If you've never used a Miro board, today's your day. It's a great way to collaborate, and we invite you to use that. So more on that in a second. So yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide then.
I would just like to add a couple of things before we continue.
Please, yep.
And I'm sorry if I have a bit of a delay. I have the impression that I say things and then it doesn't resonate straight away. Just to give you a little bit of context, since the beginning of the year, APF is going through a huge transformation. And as part of this transformation, there is an effort into becoming ever more a community and doing things together and producing content together. So as part of the Global Foresight Summit that we participated on, 2 sessions had a lot of impact, which were Sylvia's on philosophy and Chris's on ethics. Those 2 sessions together became a discussion group of ethics and philosophers in the APF. And since we started the group, our vision was that we could debate things, and then from those debates, we could go deeper on topics and produce knowledge. So this, the work on philosophy, ethics, and biofutures is actually the first baby that has moved on to its second step, which is the open collaboration and discussion. And the goal is that we produce knowledge together. So the invitation that Lisa was talking about is in that sense. We would like to, of course, the ones that want to be involved in this, we would like to get your email so we can continue this conversation and move on to the next steps. I just felt like it would be good for you guys to have a little bit of context of where we came from and where we are going with this. With that said, I hand over to Lisa.
Thank you, Bibi. No, the context is really important, actually, and it in fact sort of models the idea that what we want to do is think about our thinking and share with others what we're thinking. And so I had that context in my head, and thank goodness Bibiana can read minds, and she was able to articulate that. So in the frame of how do philosophy and futuring fit together, you can probably think of a lot of different ways. One of the ways that I was thinking about, and that I personally feel very strongly about, is that philosophy is not immune to this idea of evolution. And if you talk to philosophers today, particularly those who have been in the field for a long time, one of the things that they are concerned about is how does philosophy sort of keep up? Philosophy's been around, as we heard from other speakers this morning, since ancient times in both the East and the West. And some ways it's changed a lot, and in other ways it really hasn't. And there are great things about that. And then there are some other things that are counter to objectives. So one of the things, as you see up on the screen right now, is there are actually some trends in global philosophy. This is one of the ways that foresight and philosophy fit together. I have not yet read through this book. I've only read excerpts of it, but it's a demonstration of the fact that philosophy can enhance foresight and vice versa. When we think about philosophy and trends that are going on there, this book has lots of great academic and research writing about other aspects of globalization that have impacted philosophy. So thank goodness we're seeing writers and literature about non-Western philosophical views, about Native American feminist views, indigenous environmental philosophy. So if you want to learn more about this, that might be one place to go. All of those concepts are sort of interwoven together, and that's in the literature. But let's talk about how we see philosophy and foresight in our day-to-day. And Bibi, if you wouldn't mind advancing that slide. Earlier, we heard from Raphael, if I remember correctly, about the metaverse. And interestingly, 2 weeks ago, when we did this presentation, Facebook had not yet announced that it was calling itself Meta and the metaverse. And that's an example of to me, how quickly things are changing, as we know, through technology, but also another example of how philosophy and futures are intertwined. Because what Raphael brought up was this idea of reality. What is reality? Where does reality live? And the story I'm going to tell you now is another example of that. There is sorry, can we go back to the other slide there? Yeah. There's a philosopher who works at, I think she's in Toronto now. Her name is Karina Vold. She wrote an article several years ago called, "Are You Inside Your Skin, or Is Your Smartphone Part of You?" And if I were going to guess, most of us have our phones close by. And if you're like most people who use smartphones, Your phone has a great deal of information about you. Who you call, who you talk to is just the least of it. You know, it knows your birthday. It knows maybe some of your thoughts and ideas if you use some of the apps on there to capture those thoughts. And Dr. Vold wrote an article that she tells a story in which a criminal, a gunman, opened fire in a public place, and he very sadly wounded and killed a number of people and quickly tried to escape the scene in his car. So he jumps in his car and he's, going down the highway, and he's being chased by the police. And as a result of that high-speed crash, he rolled his car and he was killed. And the police on the scene went to his car, found the suspect deceased, and also found his cell phone there close by him. And wanting to know more about the criminal, they thought, well, if we could get to his cell phone information, we might be able to know more about his associates. We might be able to know more about other plans that he might have. But they found the cell phone locked, as a lot of us have our cell phones locked. So what they did was they took the corpse's, his dead corpse's thumb, and put the thumb on the fingerprint recognition feature to unlock his phone, which gave them access to the data and the information on his cell phone. So there are lots of reasons why that story has implications for what we're talking about today. One reason why Carina Vold wrote about it was because she was asking questions about where our thoughts live, where the mind lives, what constitutes the mind, what constitutes thought. And she posed the idea, well, if our cell phones actually have information and thoughts about us, should those be protected in the same way that our mental thoughts are protected by speech and things like that? She asked about whether the biology of a person or a creature alone captures the entirety of who we are, or whether there's more to it. There's even some discussion about whether cell phones and smartphones should be considered remains, digital remains of people when they pass on. And so I use that as an introduction to foresight to demonstrate how intertwined those concepts are. We'll give you the resource later if you want to learn more about that. Bibiana, let's go to the next slide. But it's also a demonstration of how intertwined concepts, not just in philosophy, but many of the concepts we'll talk about today, are intertwined. And to have a good conversation, sometimes pulling those things apart can be really important. Elizabeth is our ethicist, and she's going to walk us through some other definitions. But I just want to ground us today in this idea that philosophy is huge. It's a huge concept, and we all know that. Today, we're really just talking about thinking, about critical thinking, and about the discipline of philosophy, why it might matter to foresight. I've also have on the slide here, you might hear ethics and morals be talked about as the same concept. Some people think about them as the same, some think they're different, somewhere in between. I leave you to make your own decision on that. I will say that one thing I find helpful is to think about ethics as something that might belong within a society or a culture. Sometimes those then will change depending on which society or culture you're in. Whereas morals are sometimes thought, not always, but sometimes thought about as existing within an individual, less likely to change over time unless you have a dramatic change in your point of view. We probably won't get to discuss whether that's how you view it today or not, but we welcome that conversation. And then an important distinction, I do think, between ethical dilemma and conflict. Ethical dilemmas are situations in which a person is faced with choices, none of which are morally acceptable. We contrast that with an ethical conflict where the person who's choosing between at least two options has an ethical choice that they can make that is morally acceptable. So it doesn't mean that those things can't both be difficult, but sometimes getting wrapped up in that language can halt conversations, and we want to at least start to be able to have a language there. We'll go into a little bit more of that with when we talk with Elizabeth. So let's go on to our next slide here. So if I asked all of you to think about how you would define philosophy, what philosophy is or what the branches are, especially if you get philosophers in a room, it's not likely that they'll agree exactly how to position philosophy and its branches, its doctrines, its schools of thought. Rather than trying to sort that out today, I just want to present one way to think about it that we'll talk about today. Generally, philosophers will at least agree that the three core branches of philosophy are prominent in the discussion. One is metaphysics, one is epistemology, and the other is ethics. And we'll talk about ethics more deeply today. We'll dive in just a little bit further into each of these. So we'll start with metaphysics. And what I think is so interesting about the conversation that we've had so far today is that we've already talked a lot about metaphysics. We can advance the slide. Thank you. So when we heard from Hofvenschiöld, again, was one example. I also made some notes here. We heard about change. So the speaker just before us, I believe it was Dr. Gardner, was talking about change. Metaphysics asks questions about what is the nature of reality and what is the nature of what exists. It includes things like terms like ontology, which you probably have heard of, teleological, which means what's the purpose of everything. And if you're anything like me during the COVID pandemic in its worst time, you were thinking a lot about what's the meaning of all of this and how can I make good use of this? What's the purpose in this? But these are the questions that philosophers ask and that you probably ask that can add a lot of richness to futuring and to foresight. Some of the questions asked, I'll just leave you to see on the slide there, but they're really deep questions about, does the world exist? And if so, how? Now we're talking about creating digital twins and metaverses. And, that's really as if it wasn't already mind expanding. Now we're going to have more mind expanding conversations. So that's metaphysics. Epistemology is about the nature of knowledge. Some of the questions that might get asked, you see over there on the right side, there are plenty of others. But one reason why I think it's interesting to talk about the nature of knowledge is because we often talk in epistemology about the past, present, and future. And we could talk about those as objects of knowledge. What is the past? What is the future? What is the present? Which could add some more richness to the dialogue as well. I will say that right before we go to ethics, I do just want to be as inclusive as I can in this conversation and say very openly that when I think of philosophy, I think of much more than Western philosophy. I think of all sorts of philosophies, not just the kind that started in Greece in the West. We think of the East, but we also think of all kinds of different philosophical schools and traditions. And I invite you to think about that as we move on to ethics. So I'll take this over to Elizabeth now to talk to us about ethics.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Bibi, as well. Ethics, what is ethics? I'm very excited to share with you one of the ways in which you can view ethics. As Lisa said, philosophy can be cut up in several different ways. It's the same with ethics as well. Here today, we've got a categorization that looks at ethics in terms of meta-ethics, normative, applied, and descriptive. And each of these are quite different. At the same time, I think I'll start with meta-ethics. And I have to be honest, when I heard about Facebook changing its name to Meta, and since I'm an applied ethicist, it made me extremely thoughtful. Why is this? If we think of metaphysics looking at reality, what is reality? What kinds of reality do we have? And epistemology as trying to understand how you gather knowledge for that reality. Ethics looks at the values that we assign in our particular realities. So it's essentially, for me, definitely at the heart of daily life, because it's about getting clear on what matters to us. And obviously, this is quite different for different types of people, different groups, different nations, and obviously also different ethicists and different philosophers. So meta-ethics at a very high level, no pun intended there, is looking at what the values that are being assigned to as good or bad. So it's really taking a step back and thinking, not necessarily defining what good or bad is, but just really asking yourself, what makes something good? What makes something bad, what makes something right, and what makes something wrong. And once you've done that very sort of deep philosophical thinking about what those things are, then we can move on to normative ethics. Normative ethics is the branch of ethics that has different schools of thought as to what is good and what is bad. So it's rather prescriptive. I'm going to go into that a little bit later on into more depth, because normative ethics is typically what most people think of as ethics. However, it's just one branch of that. Applied ethics is a little bit more detailed because it's the ethics of certain contexts, like robot ethics or AI ethics. So it's applied in the sense that perhaps you take one or two schools of thought from normative ethics, let's say deontology, and you apply that to a certain area or a discipline of study. We're going to get some really good examples of this later on, because we're looking at the ethics of biofutures, and perhaps we have invented a new field of applied ethics, biofutures ethics, which we're very excited about. Descriptive ethics is slightly different because it takes into consideration all three, meta, normative, and applied, but turns it on its head, because in descriptive ethics, it's where researchers, practitioners go out in the field and they ask a particular group or population, what do you think is good? What do you think is bad? And therefore gather data and then extrapolate what their values are. And this kind of, perhaps I'm bold enough to say crazy for philosophers or ethicists, because they tend to, at least in the past, not necessarily do field work. So it's really nice to see this mix now of ethicists, philosophers, as well as sociologists, anthropologists, futurists going out into the field and not making assumptions, but asking others what they think is good and bad. Bibi, could we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So here we have a couple of questions, because, it's perhaps not enough to say meta-ethics is taking a step back and, what should I do in a particular situation? The kinds of questions you would ask in meta-ethics is, what is good? What are the various definitions of what good is? Or what are the factors that I need to think about? In normative ethics, the main question that people ask themselves is, what should I do, or how should I act? And what you should do or how you should act is normally defined by a set of conditions from the different schools of thought. In applied ethics, the question is even more specific. It's like, what should I do in this particular situation? Or what should I do in this particular context? What are the things I'm going to have to think about to come to what we call a good decision? So ethics is really a tool that helps us differentiate between a good and a bad decision. And descriptive ethics is really questions surrounding, what do other people think are good? What do other people think are bad? And what are the conditions that need to take place for something to be good or bad? Perhaps next slide, Bibi, thank you. Okay, back to normative ethics, where most people kind of tend to stay. Because why? It's really rather helpful. It actually explains what is right or wrong for a certain school of thought, what is good and bad, and what is just and unfair. And it also normally tends to provide a path to help you get answers in situations that are morally or ethically relevant. They're pretty comprehensive, depending on the school of thought. And normally they're also simple enough to guide action in the sense that some schools of thought maybe have a list of 10 questions that you can run through. And then once you've run through those 10 questions, you have a better idea of where you are in terms of deciding on how to move forward in a decision. And it also has basic or systematic principles. So it's really sort of a good overview of all the effort that many meta-ethicists have put into and translated for a certain group of people. If we could go on to the next slide, please. I'm just seeing here particular religions and action space of what priests say. Is that ethics? Yes, it can be. It's really interesting. We got a similar question in our last session. Again, it depends on how you see ethics and philosophy. So just to answer this question now, because it popped up at a very good time, you could probably, many ethicists would say that you could fit that into a school of thought within normative ethics. So you could put a certain branch of Christianity in here because what is good and what is bad is defined for them. I'm not sure how that group of Christianity would feel, for example, by putting them into the area of normative ethics. They may even say, we don't even need meta-ethics because we know what is good and what is bad. So they sort of take over the whole area of ethics, but that's a whole different discussion. And I'm happy to discuss that, but perhaps not here because our time is very limited. So here are a couple of schools of ethics that are quite typical. These are Western. At the same time, there are many, many more. And we also have a lot of resources for you. I'm just going to tell you of one right off. It's the IEEE ethically aligned design. There are some really great short examples of different types of ethics, for example, Shinto ethics, and how those can be applied to certain contexts. So a very popular school of ethics is deontology. This is rights-based ethics. And it's really quite clear to deontologists of what is right and what is wrong. A good example of a deontologist is John Rawls. I'm pretty sure you are, maybe some of you are familiar with his work and his theory of justice and the veil of ignorance. We also have virtue ethics, which is from the time of Socrates and Plato. And it's rather interesting because virtue ethics seems to be becoming more and more popular now, especially in the field of AI ethics. We have our consequentialists. We also have our principle-based ethics, and that's also rather popular nowadays in many fields of applied ethics because it is prescriptive, and at the same time, it's quite broad. You can interpret your principles, for example, of transparency or non-maleficence or beneficence in different ways. So this is just a very brief overview of some of the schools within the area of normative ethics. And now I'm going to hand over to Bibi.
And I was muted. I'm sorry. Here we go. Before I start talking about biofutures or biopresence, I'd like to tell you how I started on futures. 10 years ago, my thesis or my dissertation was about science fiction. And one of the main things of science fiction was that it was never about the future, but about the present. So science fiction is one of the ways that we use to make the ethical questions and to exercise the philosophical thinking of the what if, and then what could and what could not, and then what, and is it or is it not? And we're living in a very, very particular time where not all, of course not, but most of the things that we thought about as science fiction are about to become reality in a way or another. That's a big affirmation, I know, but we are seeing such exponential evolution and development in technology, in biotech, in space tech, that many of the things that we thought so far as fiction are about to become present. And then what? And what about the questions? And how do we live in a metaverse? There's virtual and real and ruled by a guy who's probably a lizard. I don't know, that's just a joke. I don't think he's a lizard, but there are some questions there about for our freedom, things that are happening. And when we talk about genetics, we are at a very special point in time. Maybe as special as when Darwin created the theory of evolution. And I'm going to tell you why. There are, as you can see in this slide, some fields of genetics, and these are not all, so these are non-exhaustive. I just chose the ones that are more relevant for us. But what we have here is cytogenetics and epigenetics, or the study of chromosomes, and in epigenetics, the study of how we can switch on and off chromosomes and switch on and off genes that bring behaviors and physical conditions. And that is a reality of today. Then we have populational genetics, something that started with Darwin, but it's how we trace mutations and basically how we can say where we came from if we do an ancestry test. Then we have the developments of genetics in itself, the study of the mechanism that promote that. And we have genomics. Genomics has become very famous recently because with genetic testing that you can do, many apps now have do diets with your DNA and train based on your DNA and everything based on your DNA. So genomics is rising in the market as a big trend. And then we have molecular genetics and biochemistry. It's a big field, but it's the field that studies the structure of genes. And it's the field related to DNA testing, but not only. We have here D2C GT, that's how the market calls it, direct to consumer genetic testing. So there's a whole market on you doing tests. It started with Ancestry, with 23andMe, and nowadays you have tests even to see if you're a good match for your partner, which honestly, all geneticists that I've spoken with are like, this is completely shit, but it's in the market. There are for specific traits of the brain, and I've just done one for epigenetics to see which of my genes are turned on and off, things like that. Then part of molecular genetics and biochemistry, there was a discovery that changed everything. And that discovery is called CRISPR's Cas9. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because here is where things become sci-fi. CRISPR-Cas9 was a discovery of Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Dolan of a protein from a bacteria that is capable of identifying a particular genetic sequencing and changing it according to what you want. I won't get technical because I cannot get technical. I'm not a biochemist or a geneticist, but it allows you to change your genes. That one discovery changes everything. And when asked about that, Jennifer said, if people would have asked me a year before I discovered it, if it was possible, I would say they would take 10 or 20 years. And in itself is a great discovery. They got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for it. But then we start seeing the applications, and those two professionals are scientists, are completely ethic driven. If you see their interviews, they are even scared of what they discovered, because what other people are doing with it is something that then becomes a problem. We have genome engineering as part of what is possible with that. So basically, if you go to California, you can already choose a baby, the eye color of your baby, and what we call design babies. So that's already to a very little extent at the moment, but it will become bigger, already can choose their genes and their children's genes, and that's completely breaking the chain of evolution, really, right? So what are the consequences of that? So within genetic engineering, we have commercial exploitation, apart from scientific use and apart from medical research, which are done with a series of procedures and in an ethical way. There is the things that are not. So then you have genome engineering and the exploitation of that for market uses. And I decided to bring this one guy for you because he's against that. His name is Josiah Zainer. He is a former NASA engineer. And today he is the biggest or the loudest biohacker. There's a community out there that is doing self-inflicted genetic engineering on themselves. They have kids at home. Apparently, CRISPR-Cas9 is a very easy technology to do. And what Josiah advocates for is that people have to have the knowledge. So he's not advocating that people should all experiment on themselves and do everything. What he advocates is that we should have the knowledge not to be on the hands of others. And that is something that's going to be important once further on when we see some of the implications of the futures, of the biofutures. Then we have this guy, Gene Drive, based on CRISPR-Cas9. Kevin Asvelt, he's from the MIT, developed a technology where you can mutate the genes of a certain species from the embryos or from the cells, meaning that that mutation will be passed forward to the other, to the following generations. And that is completely changing evolution. And that has serious questions, and he's a serious guy, all right? He wants to do the job and he wants to experiment, but he knows how hard it is and how ethically he has to handle those things. So for example, in Africa, they have a serious problem with malaria that it could be dealt with, and that was experiment that it was actually dealt with. The community chose to do it because so he programmed the malaria mosquitoes to only have male baby mosquitoes, and it's the female that passes on malaria. So in a generation or two, you wouldn't have more females and you wouldn't have more malaria. But with only males, and 4 or 5 generations, you won't have the mosquito anymore. And then those are the implications that have to be like, what is the ecosystemic consequence of you killing the mosquitoes, you know, wiping them out? And in Africa, they as a community chose to run that risk because it was a serious problem. Another thing was that it was similarly done on New Zealand, where they had a serious problem of rat infestation, and it was a not indigenous species, and it was killing all the birds. So they had like years of discussions with the natives, with the indigenous people, with all kinds of views, like as Elizabeth was saying, theological views, ethical views, moral views, different perspectives to choose to kill the rats. Because what happens once you take the rats out of the forest? We don't know the implications, the systemic implications of that. So I wanted to bring you this before talking about the futures, just because this is the present. And honestly, for me, it's quite scary. It's a very futuristic present. And we come to biofutures, or this analysis of the media and collective imaginaries. For a long time, we've been talking about what is to be human and what are the frontiers of humanity. So here, considering DNA or considering traits, we've clusterized in 4 different groups some of the main themes behind dealing with genetics and biofutures. The first one is genetocratics, or genetic determinism, which is all the futures in which genetic data determines social and economical level. We have that in Brave New World, probably the first big fiction to talk about it. Then we have more recently Gattaca, which was a film that really brought that discussion on, and I really recommend. And it became something even for young adults. So we have the Convergent Divergent series, which explores that in detail. What about the fact that you were born in a different, in a certain cluster or way or gene, and then you have to do that, and you're predetermined to follow that life. And what are the consequences when you don't fit in to what you're supposed to fit in? Then we have a cluster that I think is amazing, the Methuselanials, or prolonged lives, all futures in which life is prolonged, either by genes, conscious uploads, body sleeps, or other means. Altered Carbon explores that in a very straightforward way, where basically people change sleeves and keep the conscious, and then they have the Methuselanials, which are the people that have lived the longest, and they have the money to keep on their skins, so they don't change bodies. Other people just re-upload their conscious to an 80-year-old granny. Sometimes they don't get to choose. Like, it's mandatory for you to re-upload your conscious. You cannot die, but if you don't have the means, then you don't choose your body. You get a random other body. We don't choose our bodies now, but we have some agency on how we deal with them, right? And then this picture in the middle here, I really like, is from a series called Love, Death, and Robots. It's an anthology of different sci-fi perspectives. This one, they have the Methuselanials. So this lady is like 100 or 200 years old, and they live up in the sky. The thing is, for you to be a Methuselanial and live up in the sky and have the perfect life and be young forever, you cannot have children. We know myths like that. They're called vampires, or the idea that you don't create life. And what are the consequences of that once that we are programmed to continue life with other people and not continue our own lives? So those questions are really interesting. And if you watch this, it's like maybe a 40-minute episode. They go down to Earth and they see people that have kids, that chose to stay on Earth to have kids. And the guy's like, but why? And the woman's like, why not? And how not? How could you not want to have a family, to produce life? This is a very beautiful discussion. Then we have enhanced versus natural, all futures in which there is a divide between either tech or bio-enhanced beings and natural humans, creating societal division, discrimination, power and power unbalance in either sides. That is pretty clear on Westworld, if you guys saw it. Another episode of Love, Death, and Robots, where they have this the discussion there is that there are two brothers. One is enhanced, the other is not. And the one that's not enhanced is discriminated and feels left out with because it and he can't. Or iRobot, the film version where Will Smith chooses not to be. Oh, sorry, my internet connection is unstable. I hope I'm still here. So there's this whole discussion behind it. And then we have between angels and androids, a last cluster that deals with all futures in between that might not include genetic directly, but deal with the post-Homo sapiens sapiens. So we have ex machina here, the idea of an android that is so perfect that she's more intelligent and she's more human than human, and she takes over humanity, or the idea of matrix, or where this post-human sapiens actually lives in a metaverse, or the idea of Blade Runner, where you really don't know who is and who's not natural. So between angels and androids being the two metaphorical limits of humanity, angels in a more theological or philosophical way, and androids on the technological way, right? So within those four clusters, we can find some similarities or common fears in the narratives, and that's interesting. First of all, social inequality, or how only the rich will have access to certain technologies, creating an even bigger inequality than the ones we currently have. Inequalities that can be life or death defining. This is real, this is serious, this is something that we all have to address. And that is why Josiah Zainer advocates for genomic literacy. So we are not just victims of whoever has the money and victims of whoever can do it, right? Because honestly, if you're not Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, I'm sorry to tell you that then you're one of us here in the world that has to live with this. Then we have discrimination, a deep social divide amongst our biological and artificial differences, creating factions of society and generating wars, civil and military. And this can go even for like the revolution of the machines, or iRobot, or like the machines coming against us, or just us not being, we are humans, and being humans, we are already not able to deal with our differences, and then add enhancements and add technology to that. And how will discrimination play out when someone can be genetically perfect, designed to be perfect, and someone cannot? And then we have society control, the idea that a group, an institution, or even individuals can control all of us by data or order, therefore controlling society as a whole. That's a big watch out. We have today in the West 4 big corporations that run most all of our data. And all of our things go through GAFA, right? And then if you add on China, you have Tencent, Alibaba, the Chinese government, and it's a handful, honestly. In 2 hands, you can put on the companies that run the world. And then how are we going to deal with that? So, to finalize, there are some reflections, and to show how this was a build-up, we drank a little bit from Matthew Nolan talk on biotech and ethics, and he raised some very interesting questions. The first of all is he brought the idea of alchemy, which is being talked about a lot, and it comes from the word alchemy, meaning perfection. So algeny would be the quest for synthesizing a more perfect life. And the many problematic questions of that. What is a perfect life? What is not? You define that. But then there's something in all of us that's tempting. And how can we resist a more perfect child, or optimal health, or global food security, or physical and mind enhancements? Hard. Like the devil is in there, right? The details, those are tempting propositions. Therefore, this creates an ethical ambiguous ambivalence represented by two questions that he brought, which is like, who gets what, how much, when? That question kind of synthesizes the idea of inequality. So is it for all? Is it for some? Is it only for a few? And this very provocative one, shall the bio-enhanced inherit the earth? Are we walking towards a future where only the so-called perfect or genetically perfect will inherit the earth, or whatever else we might be? And then he brings the idea that yet trait is not fate. But the question here that we should ask ourselves is it or is it not? Like, we like to think of the idea that trait is not fate and that we have some agency here, but do we? And from Darwin, we learned that evolution flourishes in diversity. But the question is, are we walking down the diversity path, really? Because it looks like sometimes that all we want is more of the same and to homogenize society instead of flourish in diversity. Those are the questions. Now I'll hand it over. This is the wrap up of the Biofutures, and I will hand over to Lisa, and maybe we'll change to Miro board.
Thank you so much, Bibiana. Well, while you were sharing that information, I know you probably couldn't keep track of the chat. So Elizabeth and I were looking over there. Lots of really interesting discussion. I just want to call out two things, and then what we probably ought to do, because we have to close in 3 minutes. We may just want to go to the invitation. But just wanted to call out, thank you for the conversation in the chat. There was some comments that perhaps I just want to acknowledge. Graciela had asked about, wow, why it seems like a lot of the futures are presented in a dystopian way, and what can we do about that? Umar also brought up Black Mirror, which perhaps you could talk a little bit about later, and you mentioned, Umar, the tension and the trade-offs that series bring home. So it sounds like this is great to see that we want this discussion and we want this engagement, and perhaps Bibi, if you want to share how people can stay involved, maybe that's where we could go next.
Perfect. So shifting from me to we was the invitation, and the reason that we thought presenting this to you fitted is because we want to create this together with you. So after presenting the basics of philosophy, ethics, and the biofutures that we gathered, what we want is to create with you the content. We have some guiding questions there, but I'm not going to go into that. I'll just say that we are gathering the emails of people that are interested in continuing this work with us. And this work might take the former shape of an article that we're going to write and publish on Compass and other Futures publications. It might take, as it has, the form of talks. It might take the form of workshops, but we are really, really interested in continuing to explore biofutures with the ethics and philosophy lenses. And if you are interested in that work with us, please, I guess the easiest way would be to put your email on the chat, considering you have little time. Put your email on the chat, and we will get in contact.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I see that people are doing that, and thank you to our organizers at the APF for making this possible. We will be in touch with you, and you can get in touch with all of us. I will just wrap up to say thank you to Bibiana for this very interesting and thought-provoking content, Elizabeth for your applied ethics expertise and helping us understand the applications to what's going on. Please, again, do get in touch with us. Our goal is to create some content and to do that together with you.
Maybe we can also share our email on the chat so people can reach us.
Sounds like a great idea.
I will stop sharing the screen, share my email with you guys, but I would just like to thank you all for your time and for your interest here. And I'm sorry I couldn't see any of the chat things because I was sharing the screen. So yeah, I want to have all these conversations that I haven't had. Let's have the conversation.